Billy the Kid killed 8 men. Jesse James robbed banks for 16 years before a bullet finally caught up with him. That's the resume that made them legends. Now imagine a warrior so feared the U.S. government sent a quarter of its entire army after him and still couldn't catch him. That's not a movie plot. That's real. And he's not even the scariest name on this list. Stick around, because by the end of this video, Feared Outlaw is going to sound like a participation trophy. Quick line in the sand before we start. Outlaws were criminals. They robbed strangers for money. The men on this list were defending their homes against an army, and they still managed to become the most feared fighters on the continent. Different motive, same terror. Let's rank them. Roman Nose. Tribal nation, Cheyenne. Picture this, a battlefield in 1860s Colorado. A wall of soldiers, rifles ready, and one man, 6 foot plus, built like a nightmare, rides his horse in a straight line across the entire front, just outside of rifle range. Not charging, not retreating, just daring them to hit him. That's Roman Nose, and he did this over and over. Roman Nose believed a specific war bonnet made him bulletproof, and for years, riding straight through gunfire that killed men around him, he proved it right. Soldiers watched him do this and started believing it too. Here's where it gets dark. In September 1868, at the Battle of Beecher Island, Roman Nose found out the ritual protecting that bonnet had been broken. Someone had touched food with a metal fork, violating the spiritual conditions of his protection. He knew what that meant. He told his warriors he was going to die that day. He rode into battle anyway. He was hit. He died that night. A man who believed correctly every time until the one time it mattered that he was untouchable. That's not recklessness. That's a man who looked death in the eye on principle, and it's only entry number 1. King Philip, Metacom. Tribal nation, Wampanoag. Now, rewind 150 years earlier to a war so brutal it still holds a record most people have never heard of. Metacom. The colonists called him King Philip, watched his people's land get swallowed up piece by piece by English settlers. His father kept the peace. Metacom decided the peace was over. Proportionally, King Philip's War may be the deadliest conflict in American history, deadlier by percentage of population killed than the Civil War. 14 months, dozens of towns burned or abandoned, an entire region brought to its knees by one coalition led by one man. Colonial forces hunted him relentlessly, put a bounty on his head, and finally killed him in August 1676. And then, because a dead leader wasn't punishment enough, they cut off his head and displayed it on a pole in Plymouth for over 20 years. They wanted every colonist walking by to know exactly how afraid they'd been. Osceola, tribal nation, Seminole. Swap the New England woods for Florida swampland. Mosquitoes, alligators, waist-deep water, zero visibility. Now imagine trying to fight a war in there against an enemy who knows every inch of it and you know none of it. That was the U.S. Army's problem with Osceola. Starting in 1835, Osceola led Seminole and Black Seminole fighters, many of them formerly enslaved people who found refuge with the Seminole, in a resistance campaign against forced removal. His fighters would hit fast and vanish into a terrain the army simply could not follow them into. This became the most expensive Indian war in U.S. history, costing the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars in 1830s money, and roughly 1,500 American soldiers' lives, against a resistance force that, at its absolute peak, may not have topped a few thousand people total, including non-combatants. The swamp did more damage to the U.S. Army than most battlefields ever did. And how did they finally get Osceola? Not in a battle. They captured him under a white flag of truce, a move so dishonorable even Americans at the time were disgusted by it. He died in captivity in 1838. They couldn't beat him fair, so they didn't fight fair. Red Cloud, tribal nation, Oglala Lakota. Every name on this list fought hard. Only one of them actually won. Red Cloud led a coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors against U.S. forts built straight through Lakota hunting grounds in Wyoming and Montana. And in December 1866, his forces did something that should sound impossible. They wiped out an entire 81-man U.S. Army detachment in a single engagement, the Fetterman Fight, the worst defeat the Army had suffered on the plains up to that point. Red Cloud's war ended with the United States government formally surrendering. In the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, the U.S. agreed to abandon its forts entirely and hand the territory back Historians widely consider it the only war against the United States that a Native American forces ever won outright, on the battlefield and on paper. He didn't die in battle. He didn't die in captivity. Red Cloud lived into his 80s, outliving nearly every other war leader of his era, having beaten the U.S. Army at its own game. Cochise. Tribal nation, Chiricahua Apache. Some names become adjectives. Cochise is one of them, still used today, over 150 years later, to mean pure, unbreakable defiance. In 1861, a U.S. Army officer botched a negotiation so badly, an incident known as the Bascom Affair, that Cochise and his family barely escaped with their lives. That was the moment Cochise decided peace with the Americans was finished. What came next was a decade of guerrilla war across brutal Arizona mountain terrain, where Cochise did what Osceola did in the swamps, turn the landscape itself into a weapon, letting a small band of fighters tie down forces many times their size. He finally made peace in 1872, but only with one man he trusted, an Indian agent named Tom Jeffords. After Cochise died of illness in 1874, the U.S. broke that agreement almost immediately and removed his people anyway. Even in peace, the betrayal followed him. Victorio. Tribal nation, Chiricahua Apache. If you'd ask a U.S. Army officer in 1879 who scared them most, there's a real chance the answer wouldn't have been a famous name at all. It would have been Victorio, a name most people today have never even heard. This wasn't a man hiding from a fight. He was picking fights on his own terms and winning them. Victorio's band ambushed patrols, wiped out smaller Army detachments, and hit ranches, wagon trains across Texas, New Mexico, and northern Mexico, and then disappeared before reinforcements ever arrived. Soldiers weren't just failing to catch him, they were dying trying. With a band that rarely topped a couple hundred people, including women and children, Victorio's campaign got so costly that the U.S. Army and the Mexican military, two governments that rarely cooperated on anything, started coordinating cross-border operations specifically to bring him down. That's how seriously they took him. Normally, hostile militaries put their rivalry aside because neither one could handle him alone. And it wasn't just the soldiers who were terrified. Victorio's raids emptied out settlements, ranchers abandoned homesteads, mining camps shut down, and travel through parts of the Southwest became so dangerous that entire routes were avoided for months at a time. He knew the water sources, he knew the terrain. He knew exactly how his pursuers thought. He used every bit of it to pick when and where to strike, turning nearly every engagement into a trap laid on his terms, not theirs. It ended in October 1880 at the Battle of Tres Castillos, when Mexican forces finally cornered his band. Accounts differ on exactly how he died, enemy fire or by his own hand to avoid capture. Either way, one of the most effective guerrilla campaigns in North American history ended on that hillside, and it took two armies working together to end it. Crazy Horse. Tribal nation, Oglala Lakota. You know this name. You might know why it's earned its reputation. Crazy Horse wasn't flashy. No dramatic bulletproof rituals, no riding along enemy lines for show. He was something far scarier to a professional military. Patient, disciplined, and always thinking 2 moves ahead. Days before Custer's disaster at Little Bighorn, Crazy Horse used decoy tactics to lure an overconfident cavalry unit into a trap at the Battle of the Rosebud. Then, on June 25, 1876, he helped lead the combined Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces that annihilated Custer's entire 7th Cavalry Detachment at Little Bighorn, one of the most catastrophic defeats in U.S. military history. He surrendered in 1877 under a promise of fair treatment. Months later, at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, he was killed during what many Lakota still consider a betrayal of that surrender. The Army couldn't beat him in the field, so once again, they got him after he put his weapon down. Geronimo. Tribal nation, Apache. Remember that fact from the very beginning of this video? The one about a quarter of the U.S. Army? This is where we finally answer it. Geronimo's war didn't start with politics. It started with grief. In 1858, Mexican soldiers killed his mother, his wife, and his children. Historians point to that day as the moment that shaped everything Geronimo did for the next 3 decades. By the 1880s, he was leading the last major armed native resistance in North America, from a band that, by 1886, numbered under 40 people. 40, including children. And the United States responded by sending roughly 5,000 troops after him, close to a quarter of the entire U.S. Army at the time, plus thousands more Mexican soldiers and trackers. 40 people versus a quarter of the American military, and they still couldn't force him to surrender. He walked away from the negotiating table on his own terms in September 1886, worn down by years of relentless pursuit, not captured, not defeated in battle. His legend only grew from there. He became a prisoner of war, then strangely, something of a celebrity, appearing at the 1904 World's Fair, riding in Theodore Roosevelt's own inaugural parade in 1905. He died in 1909, having outlived the entire era he came to define. No outlaw in American history ever came close to forcing that kind of response from the U.S. government. Not one. 8 men, 8 different homelands, 8 different decades, 8 different fights. But every single one of them did something no outlaw of the era ever managed. They made the most powerful military force in the hemisphere genuinely, deeply afraid. And here's the part that makes it more interesting. None of them were criminals. They were defending their families, their land, their way of life, against a government that had already broken its word to them, usually more than once. So which one shocked you the most? Drop it in the comments. And if you want a full deep dive on any single name from this list, let me know, and we'll see you in the next one.